Hello, I'm Christy Sullivan. I direct the New York Master Naturalist Program, and I work in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell University, where I'm a wildlife biologist, and I do a lot of outreach regarding wildlife conservation and management. Today I'm going to talk to you about the mammals of New York. So we're just going to talk about what makes a mammal in general, what are the main types of mammals, and then do a little survey of some of the really cool animals that we have here in New York State. So the major characteristics of the class Mammalia, one big difference between mammals and other groups is that they're an advanced group in the animal kingdom. And they have some very advanced characteristics, and they share some unique features. For example, most mammals have bodies that are covered with hair, and this can be reduced in some mammals such as whales or armadillos, for example, but for the most part, mammals have hair. Mammals also have skin with sweat, scent, sebaceous, and mammary glands. They have a mouth with teeth, but again, this can be reduced in some species such as armadillos. They have movable eyelids and fleshy external ears. And they have 4 limbs that is, in most species, and they're adapted for many modes of locomotion. They also have a 4-chambered heart. The mammalian respiratory system includes lungs, a larynx, and a muscular diaphragm, a highly developed brain. They are endothermic, so we produce our heat internally, and we're homeothermic, which means that we maintain stable body temperatures, and that's true across all mammals. We have internal fertilization that includes eggs that develop in utero with a placental attachment, except in monotremes, which are primitive mammals that lay eggs, and this includes the echidnas and the duck-billed platypus. For mammals, the young are nourished by milk from mammary glands, and that includes the monotremes. There are 3 major subclasses of mammals based on mode of reproduction and embryonic development: the monotremes, the marsupials, and the placental mammals. Monotremes are mammals that lay eggs. They're incubated in a subterranean nest, and after the eggs hatch, the young feed on milk produced by the female. Only 3 species still exist today, the duck-billed platypus and 2 species of echidna, or spiny anteaters, and all are found in Australia or New Guinea. Then we have our marsupials. They're born tiny and immature, and they have to climb out and climb into the mother's pouch or marsupium when they're very, very small. The most recognized marsupial is the kangaroo. That's the one everybody knows about. But in North America, the Virginia opossum that we have is the only species that's present in North America and in New York State. Most people have not had the opportunity to see tiny young opossums in the adult's marsupium. I have been fortunate enough one time, and it's just amazing how teeny tiny the little baby opossums are when they first crawl into that pouch. And there are placental mammals, which is the most common type of mammal in all but Australia. 95% of all mammals are placental, and the young develop over a long period of time in the female's uterus. Okay, now we're going to do a little survey of some of the mammals that we have in New York State. So the first group I'm going to talk about are the Sorex shrews, the masked, the pygmy, and the water shrew. And the first 2 shrews are pictured here, or the last 2 there, the pygmy shrew and the water shrew. And you can see they're tiny and they have very, very pointed noses. The masked shrew is the most common of the 3, but the pygmy shrew and the northern water shrew are also in western New York, but they're pretty scarce. All activities for shrews takes place in burrows or under leaf litter and other objects. They like to be under cover because if not, they're in danger of being preyed upon by other larger animals. And they have a very super high metabolic rate. So they have to eat more and more often than other mammals do. You can imagine they're very tiny. They're moving around quite actively, and they probably need to eat a lot to maintain their activity level and to maintain their body heat. This is a picture of the masked shrew, also very small. The masked shrew is about 4 inches long, including the tail, so it's a very small animal. The insects, their diet consists of insects for 65% of their diet, but they also eat centipedes, spiders, earthworms, and carrion or dead animals. Occasionally, they'll take a small animal such as a salamander or a nestling bird, which really, when you look at the size of a shrew and consider that it could eat a nestling bird, that's a pretty voracious predator, because a nestling bird, even the smallest of nestling birds, would be quite big compared to that little shrew. In the winter, shrews will feed on small, soft seeds. They require large quantities of food each day. The masked shrew does, just like the others. There's one research study where they looked at shrews in captivity and found that they ate 3.3 times their own body weight over a 24-hour period. So that's a lot of eating. And in captivity, they ate and killed others of their own species. So they are very, very voracious predators. It's a good thing they're small. Then we also have the short-tailed shrew, Blorina brevicata. And the short-tailed shrew is larger, it's more robust. You can see its head is a little bit rounder, not that really skinny head with the long pointy nose. Its nose is pointy, but not quite the same as those three very tiny Sorex shrews. The short-tailed shrew is 4 to 5 inches long. It's opportunistic in terms of what it will eat. It will eat just about anything from mice and moles to salamanders and frogs and birds and bird eggs and all kinds of invertebrates. So it'll eat lots and lots of different kinds of things. Sometimes you can see these little guys as they move around in the leaf litter in the forest. You go and sit, especially this time of year, I seem to see shrews quite a bit. You just sit out in the forest and kind of observe, and you can hear some little squeaky sounds sometimes and a rustling of the leaves. And if you look, especially along logs and other cover objects, oftentimes you'll see them kind of peek their head out as they move through the leaf litter and feed. These animals, the short-tailed shrew, are very interesting because they're venomous. They're our only venomous mammal. And their neurotoxin is powerful enough to immobilize or even kill small prey species like frogs and mice. Now, larger animals like humans, they're not going to kill us, but it's enough to make it create an irritation or even some numbness at the bite site. A short-tailed shrew has to eat about every 2 to 3 hours, and shrews are active all year round and rely on cached food materials. And what that means is that during the nice months, they procure extra food and they store it in a cache, and they'll go back when the weather's bad or the ground is frozen and uncover those caches and feed on that food. They have very limited vision, so they use echolocation, which is a series of ultrasonic clicks to make their way around the tunnel and burrows. So basically, as they're sending out those ultrasonic clicks, it's bouncing off the edges of the tunnels and burrows, and that's how they know where they should be going and how to make their way through the underground habitat. In terms of habitat, they'll live in mixed and deciduous hardwood forests with thick leaf litter, that's preferred, but they'll basically occupy all terrestrial habitats below 4,300 feet in elevation. And so for us around in the southern tier, all of our mountains even are under 4,300 feet. So I would say, the Adirondacks may be the only place where they may not be found, where it may be too high in elevation on some of the mountains. They're more fossorial than other shrews. The short-tailed shrew they tunnel extensively and to depths of 20 inches. And here's a picture of a shrew versus a mole. Even though the short-tailed shrew is the bigger of the shrews, you can see that it's pictured on the left, still much smaller than a mole. And you can see the difference if you look at the front paws of a mole, which are made for digging and excavating, how large and how long the claws are. And so that's a telltale sign that that's a mole and not a shrew. And that brings us to moles. So we have 2 species of moles in New York State, the star-nosed mole and the hairy-tailed mole. Moles are about 5 to 5.5 inches long. They have large front feet that are turned sideways with big claws. And really, looking at the bottom left corner here at this picture of a mole, their front paws are disproportionately large for their body, I would say, and really digging machines. Moles eat grubs and beetle larvae. They'll eat earthworms and some carrion or dead animals. Occasionally, they'll feed on frogs and mice. And star-nosed moles may catch minnows, so they can feed underwater, actually, and we'll learn a little bit more of them in just a moment. So again, with moles, the fact that they can eat frogs and mice is pretty amazing because they just don't look like they'd be that quick, not quick enough to catch a mouse. So moles eat 70 to 100% of their body weight each day to have enough energy to burrow, and they can burrow below the frost line in the winter. And to the right, there's a picture of a star-nosed mole, and we'll learn more about that. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this PowerPoint for right now, and I'm going to share a small video about the star-nosed mole with you.
A star-nosed mole, possessor of perhaps the most extraordinary nose on the planet. Its nostrils are surrounded by 22 fingers. Fingers that allow the mole to sense the world around it by touch alone. It enables it to detect food with astonishing speed. It can also swim. And once underwater, its nose helps it in a most extraordinary way. It blows out a bubble and breathes it back in, detecting in a millisecond if there's prey close by. This bubble blowing allows it to sniff out its food underwater, but unfortunately that means it soon runs out of breath. So it's just as well that it can hunt as fast down here as on the surface. Few creatures can hunt equally successfully, underground and underwater.
I want to show you something that is really, really stupid on my phone.
Okay, turn that off. So the star-nosed mole is just really cool. That nose is just so sensitive, and I think it's amazing that they can use bubbles to detect prey underwater as well. Okay, now oops, let me go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, now we're going to talk about flying squirrels, and these are some of my favorites. I think they're just very adorable. They're very tameable. Somebody that I work with, his wife was a middle school teacher, and they had flying squirrels that would live in their house in the winter, and they were tame enough that they could lure them in, and she could capture them to take and show her students in her class, and then just take them back and let them out. So there are two species that we have in New York State, the northern flying squirrel and the southern flying squirrel. And they're the smallest species of squirrels we have in New York State. They weigh just a few ounces. They are nocturnal, so oftentimes we don't see them, but they're actually very, very abundant. Sometimes you can see them at a bird feeder at night, for example. They're very common, but seldom seen. They have flaps of skin that extend from their wrists to their ankles, and they act as miniature parachutes. So unlike birds that flap actual wings, flying squirrels really just hold up those flaps of skin and glide. So they can drop down for about 3 feet or so before flattening out and into a glide. And they can use their legs and move and adjust them to change the position of the membranes and swerve around obstacles. So it's almost like using a Superman or Superwoman cape. From heights of about 100 feet, they can reach speeds of up to 20 miles an hour and glide as far as 50 yards, which is over half the length of a football field. They really like large areas of very mature deciduous or mixed deciduous and coniferous forests with large trees and cavities for nesting and escape cover. So these guys definitely use holes in trees, also called cavities, and they need them. They're gregarious. They oftentimes roost in groups. So they occupy old woodpecker holes in the winter, and any old hole or cavity in the tree. In the warmer months, they'll often build leaf nests in the crotch of a tree, and so they don't necessarily need to be in cavities. And they prefer if a forest stand is open beneath the tree canopy. And what I mean by open is not a lot of other layers of vegetation, so kind of clear for gliding through, so that they have unobstructed gliding. Sometimes there are up to 50 animals in one nest. So when I say they're gregarious, they really, really, truly are. I have a cabin in northern Pennsylvania, and we had flying squirrels in the attic. And by the time we realized that they were there, we started to live trap them out and move them elsewhere. And we removed 23 altogether. So they do get in houses, and they can be quite noisy once they do. They feed on truffles, which are the fruiting bodies of mycorrhizal fungi that live in association with tree roots. The fungi increases the ability of the trees to absorb nutrients and water from the soil. And by feeding on the fungi and depositing the spores of the mycorrhizal fungi through their droppings, squirrels can spread the spores throughout the forest, so they can really contribute to the health of the forest. In terms of other foods, northern flying squirrels often eat seeds, buds, fruit, insects, and small animals even. And southern flying squirrels eat seeds, hickory nuts, acorns, berries, bark, flowers, insects, and other animal matter. So the best way to manage for these guys, if you really want to provide habitat for them, is to keep live and dead trees in a forest that contain holes or cavities. Ideally, look for old woodpecker holes that are about 8 to 20 feet from the ground with an entrance hole of about 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter. Large beech trees often provide cavities and produce seeds that serve as food. And woody debris or woody material on the forest floor, so treetops and branches, can provide additional refuge from predators and also help promote the growth of fungi for food. What's really neat is if you find a cavity tree in the woods and you're walking through, and if it's a hole that you can reach pretty easily, if you knock on the tree trunk, sometimes you'll hear them. They'll make a noise kind of back, and you'll know that there are flying squirrels in those holes. So that's a fun activity to do when you're in the forest. Okay, the next species that I wanted to talk about is the mink. The mink is the characteristic marking is that little white mark under the chin. Nothing else has that little white mark. Mink can be found near streams, lakes, and marshes, often building their dens along the shore. They feed primarily on fish, crayfish, and small mammals. They'll also eat waterfowl, reptiles, and amphibians. In terms of predators, the only thing that preys on mink really is humans, coyotes, and foxes, and some owls. They're well adapted for swimming. They can dive to depths of over 15 feet, and they're active year-round. They also are just generally very active. If you ever see them feeding along a stream bank, they're constantly moving, going down, in and out of underneath the stream bank and up and over logs, and they're just very quick movers. Okay, here's the porcupine. The porcupine is the second largest rodent we have in North America. They live in coniferous, deciduous, and mixed forests. They're in New York State, they can be found statewide with higher concentrations in the Adirondacks. They rest in dens under rocks or logs, within hollow sections of trees. In the daytime, they may just hang out in trees. I've seen them in like rocky outcroppings where there are little kind of small cave areas forming. You can find, if you sometimes look in those areas, you can find big piles of droppings. And you can tell that it's porcupines because it looks like little pellets of sawdust. So it's very distinctive. And sometimes you can find that at the base of a tree as well. Fishers, bobcats, coyotes, and great horned owls will feed on porcupines. Fishers are a specialized porcupine predator, though. They're the only animal that specializes in feeding on porcupines, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So porcupines have about 30,000 quills, which are actually specialized hairs, and you can see that the quill is kind of barbed. It has these little hair-like projections that extend downward, and so once a quill goes into another animal, it's really hard to pull it out. Lost quills will regrow within a few months, so if the porcupine feels threatened and releases its quills on an animal, they will eventually grow back. Porcupines are herbivores. They feed on bark and twigs and roots and other plant material. And here to the right, you can often see where porcupines have been feeding on the bark of a tree, especially things like beech trees. You can see it's just kind of been all gnawed off. And because of feeding on things like bark and twigs, again, here on the left is a picture of porcupine droppings that I mentioned before. It really is looks like little wood pellets, if you know what a pellet stove is for generating heat. It kind of looks like wood pellets that you would use in a pellet stove. Here's the opossum. The opossum is our only marsupial in North America. They have fur-lined pouches. So the picture on the left there is a picture of the inside of the pouch of a female opossum. And you can see the tiny, tiny young opossums attached there. And they're attached in nursing. The young are born, they make their way across the abdomen to the pouch, and they stay there, crawl inside the pouch and stay there for 2 months. And then you can see once they get older, they'll ride on their mother's back, and it looks like those young pictured down there to the right are almost outgrowing that, and the mother's probably going to be happy to have them off her back. You've heard of playing possum before, and that comes from the habit that possums have of feigning death. It's called catatonia, where they remain immobile for periods of a few minutes to up to 6 hours when they feel threatened. So it's a defense mechanism. They figure if a predator thinks they're dead, they'll leave them alone. And so I like this cartoon here. I guess I should have called a few weeks ago, officer, but part of me is still convinced he's faking. Okay, possums have prehensile tapered tails that are 9 to 13 inches in length. They're black at the base with the remainder being grayish white. So by prehensile, I mean they can wrap around and kind of hold on to anything that they want to hang from. Their first or innermost toe, which is called the halix of each hind foot, is clawless and opposable. So opposable like our thumbs are. I think they're adorable, those little opossums. Next is the river otter. The river otter is a mustelid. It's part of the weasel family. They can be 10 to 30 pounds in size, so they get quite large. They live in rivers, lakes, ponds, small streams, marshes, and other inland wetlands. And they're kind of aquatic generalists, so they feed mostly on fish, but they'll also eat amphibians, crustaceans, and other aquatic invertebrates. And occasionally they'll eat a small mammal or a bird. So something like waterfowl, and even a muskrat, which is quite large. They'll eat some reptiles and even fruit. River otters are at the top of the food chain. They eat a lot of things that eat other things that are in the water. And so they have a greater chance of being exposed to elevated levels of environmental contaminants like PCBs, DDT, and heavy metals such as cadmium and mercury. So So they can be heavily affected by pollutants in the environment. That phenomenon of animals that are higher on the food chain showing higher levels of those pollutants in their body is called biomagnification. So at each level, the amount of pollution that shows up is higher and higher at each level in the food chain. Hey, this is the fisher, a really cool animal. It's really expanded its range and numbers in New York State in the last decade. The fisher is a member of the weasel family as well. Their females get to be 3 to 7 pounds and males are 7 to 13 pounds. They can climb trees and they rotate their hind feet 180 degrees, which allows them to descend down the tree head first. They really prefer extensive closed canopy forests, so they like contiguous areas of forest habitat. They severely declined during the late 1800s and early 1900s, but again have begun to return to the southern tier of central and western New York and really have expanded their range and numbers. DEC did some surveys several years back where they used beaver meat and attached it to trees and put motion sensor cameras up in various areas of the state to kind of find out how many fishers there were. And that's how they found out that there were quite a few more than they thought, and that fishers are doing quite well here in New York State. Okay, so here's another picture of a porcupine, which, as I mentioned before, fishers are a predator of porcupines, and in fact, they are a specialized predator of porcupine. So fishers will eat small to medium-sized mammals and birds, hard and soft mass, such as beechnut, acorns, apples, and berries. They will regularly kill and consume porcupines, and the way they do it is they come face to face with the porcupine, and they'll actually take from the front of the head and flip it over so that its belly is exposed, and then they'll kill the porcupine and consume it. They may travel over 100 miles over the course of a few weeks to find enough prey. So they're on the move and they're very mobile, and they need large areas of habitat. To enhance habitat for fishers, you would consider maintaining or encouraging evergreen trees as a component of the forest, retaining or creating large trees with holes in them because they do den. You can leave large logs on the forest floor or fell several large trees to create denning sites and thermal cover. Okay, now another member of the weasel family is the short-tailed weasel. The short-tailed weasel turns white. Its coat is white in the winter, which helps it blend in when there's snow. And they're also called ermine or ermine. They're small in size. They're about 6 to 12 inches in length, not including the tail. They prefer open woodlands and transitional areas between forests and fields located near a water source. Their dens can be crevices under tree roots or in rock or wood piles, in a hollow tree, under a building, in abandoned burrows, basically any place that they can find to take cover. They feed on small mammals, but they'll also eat birds, eggs, fish, lizards, snakes, frogs, insects. So they're pretty much generalists, even though they do eat primarily animal matter. And ermine will often cache leftover food. So basically, if they have some extra, they're going to store it somewhere and then go back and get it later. So I like this meme here. I got some food to go. Where do you want to eat it? Your place or mine? Okay, next we have the muskrat. The muskrat is a moderate-sized mammal, 23 to 26 inches long, with a tail of 8 to 11 inches. So the tail is very distinctive. It's scaly, it's laterally compressed, and it has a fringe of coarse hairs along the underside. So unlike the beaver, it's not very wide, it's very narrow. But they live in aquatic habitats, including ponds, lakes, marshes, and streams. And their food is primarily roots and stems of aquatic vegetation, although they are known to eat mollusks, fish, and various invertebrates. They really like to feed on cattails a lot. In streams, muskrats will burrow into the bank to create dens. And so the top slide there shows the opening to a muskrat burrow. Oftentimes you see a little slide going down where they come out and then they slide down to the water. And the burrows are often made in streams that have kind of a nice clay component to the soil so that it's easy to burrow. They also will inhabit marshy habitats where they create dome-shaped huts on firm substrate using emergent vegetation such as cattails. And these huts serve as winter push-ups or breathers. So they basically can just, to feed in the winter, they can come up from underwater and be in these little huts where they can breathe and eat and feed without being exposed. And also the huts are created within the ice, or they break through the ice when it's very thin to create the huts, and so ice will form around them then, and so it's an ice-free place to come out and get air. Now we're going to move to the meadow vole. The meadow vole is a very small mammal that feeds on grasses, sedges, seeds, tubers, and roots. They're found in meadows or open fields. They may girdle trees. Basically, girdling means chewing the bark the whole way around the trunk of a tree, and mostly small trees. In the case of a meadow vole, it would have to be because they're very small. And also shrubs in the winter, and usually that happens below the snow line. So you don't know, you might have a small fruit tree that you've planted, and you don't know until the snow melts in the spring that, oh no, it's been girdled by a meadow vole. They can create a maze of 2.5 to 5 centimeter or 1 to 2 inch wide runways by cutting the stems of small plants for food or to reach seed heads. So it's basically in the grass in a meadow, you'll see like a tunnel that's been created, and then you'll see these little clippings of grass, and that's a very telltale sign of a vole. And then sometimes you'll find inside that grass, there'll be a nice little nest, and you'll see the young baby voles as well. The meadow vole is well known for its fecundity. The females can have young any month of the year. The gestation period is only 21 days, so 3 weeks, and the young are born. They average 4 to 6 young per litter, and the females mature by the time they're 28 days old. So less than a month it takes them to mature. Then they're having 4 to 6 young, and they can have them every, once a month or something. So they're very, their populations are very dense. There can be 40 to 80 meadow voles per acre in some habitats. A lot of things eat them. They are basically a major food source for a lot of other mammals and some birds. So weasels, foxes, hawks, owls, coyotes, bobcats, and short-tailed shrews will eat them. So basically, they are basically born to be eaten. There's another species of vole that we have called the red-backed vole, and I actually think these are really good-looking little animals. They look like little teddy bears. And you can see they're called the red-backed vole because of the kind of reddish-brown or russet color hair on their backs. They really prefer moist forest habitats, especially mixed coniferous and deciduous forests, with a lot of wood on the forest floor, so logs and stumps, maybe roots, and then also rocks and twigs. They build nests from plant material as well, but things like sphagnum and dried leaves, and often under logs and stumps. They're herbivores, so they eat vegetation and fungi, and they also, though, will take small invertebrates. And an interesting fact about the red-backed vole is that they can jump 6 to 8 inches over obstacles in the woods, and they may forage in trees 7 to 10 feet above the ground. So that's pretty cool. They're pretty mobile for such a tiny little animal. Right, now I'm going to talk about the black bear, going to something bigger. The black bear is the second largest mammal we have in New York State. The moose is the largest. Most of them are black, but occasionally we see the cinnamon color phase, which is basically a color that looks like this, the color of cinnamon. Females are smaller than males. Females typically weigh 150 to 250 pounds, where males can get up to 600 pounds. And they have a large home range of up to or over 50 square miles. So they're very mobile animals and require large tracts of habitat. In New York State, the black bear range basically is covering most of the state at this point. They're not found in the Lake Plains. very often, and they're not found in New York City and Long Island, but otherwise they're pretty widespread and most abundant in the southern tier, the Catskills, and the Adirondacks. They're omnivores. Bears feed on berries, fruits, nuts, succulent plants. They'll eat honey, small mammals, amphibians, reptiles, insects, and occasionally fawns, especially very fresh and newborn fawns. They'll also eat garbage and birdseed and carrion or dead animals. From August to November, this time of year, bears have one thing on their mind. They are moving around and feeding and fueling up for hibernation. So they just are thinking about eating and getting ready for that long sleep. And during this time, they may actively feed for up to 20 hours a day, ingesting up to 20,000 calories. And I thought to myself, well, what would that be like for us? And how could we relate 20,000 calories? And so I thought, what's a really calorie-dense food that we might think of? And came to mind for me was cheesecake. So I looked up how many calories were in a Cheesecake Factory cheesecake. Approximately 8,400 calories per cheesecake, not per slice, but the whole cheesecake. And so that would be the equivalent of eating 2.5 cheesecakes a day for a black bear, which doesn't seem like a lot. It's a lot of calories, but when you're thinking about getting that many calories from seeds and nuts and fruits and the occasional animal you find, or maybe ants and beetles, that's a lot of foraging. So bears can be troublesome, especially when they find birdseed. Birdseed is very calorie dense, so it's a perfect food for bears, especially right before hibernation or right when they come out of hibernation in the spring. So it's important to keep birdseed out of the reach of bears. Typically, I don't like to hang bird feeders during the summer or spring or fall months because of bears. I will feed them or hang birdseed in the wintertime, or if I have birdseed out during the day, I'll bring it in at night to keep bears from getting into it. Because of course, once they find a food source, they're going to keep coming back for it. And if you don't have birdseed, then they'll be looking for something else. And they really can develop really bad habits that way. Bears like to den in the winter, or they find cover. Here's a great picture of a bear in the den of a large, very large dead tree. They hibernate for the winter. Males and females hibernate separately. So a female will go into hibernation a little bit earlier than the males do. They find a nice spot with good cover, maybe at the base of a tree where it's tipped up, or under a brush pile, or sometimes in other large places like a large culvert underground. The cubs are born in January while the mother is hibernating, and they'll be nursing and feeding while she's hibernating for a few months. They are up and walking by 8 weeks, and they stay in the den for 3 months, at which time they come out and stay with the mother through that first summer. They'll weigh about 60 to 100 pounds the first fall. They'll hibernate with her the second winter, and then after that second winter, when she's ready to breed again in the midsummer, then she kind of kicks them out and they're on their own. So the black bear young will stay with the female for about 2 years. So female black bears will raise new cubs about every 2 years, and they can have between 1 and 5 cubs, but 2 to 3 is the most common. So if you want to encourage or enhance habitat for black bears, you can encourage a diversity of mass-producing trees like oaks and beech, berry-producing shrubs like blueberries and blackberries. You can retain trees with large cavities, especially those with a large hole at the base of a tree, which can provide good denning habitat. If you have a forest and a timber harvest, you can leave the treetops following that harvest, or leave fallen trees in an unharvested forest for den sites. I like this sign, "Will be adorable for food." It's true, bears are adorable, they're great to watch and people love to see them, but feeding them is a really bad idea, both for people and your pets and for the bears themselves. And bears become start to look to humans for food, then they can get into a lot of trouble, and eventually that could lead to their demise. Either they need to be trapped and moved out, or they're crossing roads more often into developed areas and are more likely to be hit by cars. So it's really important not to start those habits with bears. The next animal is the coyote. The coyotes have been present in New York State since the 1920s. Originally, coyotes from the west moved east. Adults are about 35 to 45 pounds, with some males over 60 pounds. They kind of have a German Shepherd-like appearance with some grizzled gray on the back, their upper sides, and their neck. And some of them are black or reddish blonde. I've seen one down the road from me that is very, very black. They're very widespread in New York State. There are 20 to 30,000 total. I hear them almost every night outside my house, maybe in the field across the way or even in my backyard, and yet I seldom ever see them. So it's really remarkable to me how I know they're here, I know they're nearby, but they can be very secretive. Families will stay together until the fall. They have a 2 to 26 mile home range. And in the fall, you often hear family groups yapping like crazy. And if this sound works, I'm going to play it for you here. This is the sound of them communicating within their family group. There you go. And I can tell you that when they're communicating like that right outside your bedroom window at night and you're sound asleep, it can be kind of frightening when you wake up until you realize what it is. Right, again, they typically avoid people, and so they're not too much of a concern. Sometimes they can be an issue or a concern. People are concerned about their pets, and although it is possible, there's a study done by Paul Curtis in our department and his graduate student Dan Bogan looking at coyotes in Westchester County and very suburban areas, and they were collecting scats and analyzing those. And they rarely found any evidence of cats or other pets. So they eat almost anything though. They'll eat rabbits, woodchucks, small mammals, fruit, they'll eat beavers, they'll eat insects, they'll eat deer, they'll eat carrion. So oftentimes they eat dead deer, actually roadkills. Okay, so now we'll talk about deer predation. So in terms of the deer that coyotes will eat, they'll eat dead deer and fawns and unhealthy adults. So Penn State did a study a number of years ago looking at predation of fawns in 2 different areas in Pennsylvania and found that predators accounted for 50% of fawn mortality. So, and coyotes and bears accounted for about 2/3 of the predation. So what they found was that in heavily forested areas, bears were more likely to account for most of the predation, whereas in open mixed habitat or agricultural areas, the coyotes accounted for most of the predation. Fawn survival rate was highly variable in that study, between 8 and 50%. Okay, now that takes us to the bobcat. The bobcat is a really cool animal. It's elusive and solitary and mainly nocturnal, but sometimes they venture out in the daytime and often in the morning or the evening. You can see them crossing roads near a wetland or other habitat. You can find their tracks in the snow, which is a fun thing to do. They're opportunistic predators. They'll feed on all kinds of small animals like mice and voles. They'll eat squirrels, they'll eat birds, rabbits. They'll also feed on porcupines, sometimes minks, muskrats, skunks, fish, frogs. So they'll eat all kinds of things. They like to live in extensive forests, wooded swamps, places with rocky outcrops or little den areas, and occasionally in agricultural areas, sometimes in hedgerows or the tree lines between fields. They need rocky ledges and rock piles for shelter, for breeding, and for raising their young, so they like areas with rocks. They'll also use brush piles though, and hollow trees and logs for resting and denning. Enhanced habitat for bobcats, you would want to create young or what's called early successional habitat by cutting. You can build brush piles, but pretty large brush piles. You can leave treetops following a timber harvest, or you can leave large logs on the forest floor to attract prey and provide den sites. And that's all we have for today. So I hope it's giving you a good survey of some of the mammals that we have in New York State. And I thank you all very much.